In The Origin of Species, Darwin provided abundant evidence that life on Earth has evolved over time, and he proposed natural selection as the primary mechanism for that change. He observed that individuals differ in their inherited traits, and that selection acts on such differences, leading to evolutionary change. Although Darwin realized that variation in heritable traits is a prerequisite for evolution, he did not know precisely how organisms pass heritable traits to their offspring. Just a few years after Darwin published The Origin of Species, Gregor Mendel wrote a groundbreaking paper on inheritance in pea plants. In that paper, Mendel proposed a model of inheritance in which organisms transmit discrete heritable units, now called genes, to their offspring. Although Darwin did not know about genes, Mendel's paper set the stage for understanding the genetic differences on which evolution is based.
Paper mills had the worst of it for years as newspapers reduced pagination, went wholly digital, or shut for good. The papers were able to hammer down the cost of newsprint from firms fighting for business as demand declined. Price-taking paper mills suffered in silence. Many hesitated to shut massive machines costing hundreds of millions of dollars. That hesitance has disappeared. Mills are taking out newsprint capacity and diversifying. Norske Skog, a Norwegian pulp and paper firm, said in June it would close its 66-year-old Tasman mill in New Zealand, for example. Many mills are converting machines to make packaging for e-commerce. UPM, a Finnish firm, announced this year the sale of its Shotton newsprint mill in Wales to a Turkish maker of containerboard and packaging. For JCS Volga, a Russian mill, newsprint used to account for 70% of production. Now half of what it makes is packaging. Both men and women gained weight, but when it came to race, black women had the most rapid weight gain, followed by white women and then black and white men. The weight gain was just a few pounds, but even a slightly higher BMI is associated with weight-related health issues. Several reasons exist for the weight discrepancy between the single and married people. For example, married men and women may be less concerned about their body weight because they're no longer actively seeking a mate. Plus, married people have a regular dining partner, possibly leading to more meals. On the single side, those who are widowed or have gone through a divorce may lose weight due to stress. So while this news may not be good for the smug marrieds, it may be welcomed by Bridget Jones. The single and very weight-conscious, Jones may actually have had the easier path to staying thin than her married friends. Development concerns whether or not the child is growing, particularly towards their own potential as well as discovering and utilizing their own strengths and talents. Socialization takes into consideration how the teenager behaves to and participates with family, friends, siblings, and peers. With socialization, the consideration is with work habits, performance, and the teenager's general attitude towards school and their own education. When we look at children between home and school, we are looking at how the student is developing gradually for self-regard, as well as their own personality regarding their behavior and responsibilities. Some scientists want to use the DNA of African people to reconstruct the human migration story, the history of how people spread from Africa to everywhere. But many in the indigenous community who've contributed their DNA for science feel that these types of studies are waste and say they don't like being left out of the research. There's a long history about analysts and scientists going to indigenous communities, getting what they need, leaving and never coming back. University of Illinois anthropologist Ripan Mali. I learned early on that was the history in science and anthropology up entailed recently. To help change that system, in 2011, Mali launched a program that provides hands-on precise training to Native American and other indigenous scientists and researchers.
Based on the strength of Earth's gravity and the density and strength of rock, in principle you could make a single conical mountain that stretched between New York and Chicago and soared over 45 kilometers. That's twice the size of Olympus Mons and definitely dwarfs Everest. However, there are a couple of reasons why we can't actually have that humongous of a mountain on Earth. For one, Earth's crust is made up of continental plates that essentially float in the semi-solid rock of the mantle below. If you add more weight above the surface, they sink lower into the Earth's hot interior, and when they sink far enough, they soften and basically melt. For our conical mountain, that gives a new height limit of just 15 kilometers. As well, the powerful collision of two tectonic plates, which creates mountains in the first place, also fractures and cracks the rock, weakening its structure and exposing it to erosion. Over millions of years, freeze-thaw cycles pry at these cracks, while winds claw at the slopes and streams and glaciers carve deep valleys into the mountainside, all weakening the mountain support. This can end badly. For example, 764 meters tall rocky Mount Cook in New Zealand had its top fall off one night in 1991, trimming it down to a 3m mountain. Given all the factors that conspire to limit the height of mountains, for example, sinking into the Earth's mantle, fractures, and erosion, I wouldn't bet on our tallest mountains getting too much taller than they already are.
We've run a few different studies and found that the number one purchase people say they regret after bank fees is eating out. It's a frequent purchase we make almost every day, and it's death by 1,000 cuts. A coffee here, a burrito there. It adds up and decreases our ability to save. Back when I lived in New York City, I looked at my expenses and saw that I spent over $2,000 on ride-sharing apps. It was more than my New York City rent. I vowed to make a change. And the next month, I spent $2,000 again. No change, because the information alone didn't change my behavior. I didn't change my environment. So now that I was $4,000 in the hole, I did two things. The first is that I unlinked my credit card from my car-sharing apps. Instead, I linked a debit card that only had $300 a month. If I needed more, I had to go through the whole process of adding a new card. And we know that every click, every barrier, changes our behavior. We aren't machines. We don't carry around an abacus every day, adding up what we're spending, in comparison to what we wanted. But what our brains are very good at is counting up the number of times we've done something. So I gave myself a limit. I can only use ride-sharing apps 3 times a week. It forced me to ration my travels. I got a handle on my car-sharing expenses to the benefit of my husband because of the environmental changes that I did. So get a handle on whatever that purchase is for you, and change your environment to make it harder to do so.
There's growing alarm over plunging insect populations with climate change, habitat destruction, and pesticides all thought to play a role. But now, scientists say there's another culprit: artificial streetlights. Researchers from the charity Butterfly Conservation counted caterpillars at the sides of brightly lit roads. Compared with similar stretches of unlit roads, caterpillar numbers were reduced by half, suggesting streetlights can affect the abundance of insects, at least on a local scale. The scientists say with insects in trouble, we should be doing all we can to reduce negative influences. But there are practical solutions such as dimming streetlights in the early hours, installing motion sensors, or using color filters to modify the light.
The first 2 years of a baby's life are critical for brain development. In this study, parents were given video-based tips on how best to interact with their babies according to their particular needs. By the age of 3, the baby still had some developmental difficulties, but their social skills had improved, and 2/3 fewer met the criteria for a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. Compared to babies who received standard care, the research charity Autistica said the study was promising, and people should not have to wait for a diagnosis for support to be provided. But the National Autistic Society said autism was not a disease that should be cured or lessened. The research team says longer-term studies on more babies using the technique are now needed.
Psychology is a relatively new science. Like other sciences, psychology must be able to state laws. A law is a way of organizing knowledge about something so that we can make predictions. When enough knowledge is gained about a subject, a scientist can state precisely what will happen under certain conditions. We experimental psychologists are interested in developing laws about human behavior, so we'll be able to understand and predict what people do and why they do it. Of course, to develop laws about human behavior, we must assume there's some regularity to it. We can't be psychologists without making the assumption the behavior follows.
BioBonanza is a one-day open house festival. All of the researchers in the Department of Biology are going to be showcasing their research so students can come and see research, interact with the researchers. And we want people to be able to interact and have fun of this event. As soon as you walk in the doors, you'll see all sorts of activities, displays of how a human heart works. We'll have sections of spinal cord and brain. You'll get to be able to see butterflies and all sorts of insects. You'll be able to try to catch some local insects, and we'll have activities like walking through local plant gardens and seeing how photosynthesis work. There's an old-timer in the neighborhood, and it's got a story to tell. A new study of a relatively nearby star shows that it's almost as old as the Big Bang itself. The star HD 140,283 lies about 190 light-years away in the constellation Libra. Astronomers have long known that it's ancient, because it contains mostly hydrogen and helium, which were present at the dawn of the universe, and few of the heavy elements that were forged later in stellar furnaces. With the Hubble Space Telescope, researchers have now pinned down the distance to HD 140,283, which allowed them to determine how bright the star is. Along with the chemical ceremonials of the star, the newly derived stellar properties allowed for a new age estimate. The study of HD 140,283 in the Astrophysical Journal Letters found that the star is 14.46 billion years old, but the entire universe, as you may have heard, is only 13.77 billion years old. The two age estimates aren't actually in conflict, because there's always some uncertainty. The full age estimate is thus 14.46 billion years plus or minus 800 million years.
British students are required to undertake mathematics during secondary education.
Dark chocolate contains cocoa known to enhance immunity and mood.
Sentencing decisions hinge on the adjudicated guilt of the accused.